Dazed, I looked around my room. Some noise had woken me up. There was no dawn in the sky yet, so it must still be the middle of the night. And then, as I turned from the window back to my room, I saw them. Blue-green vines everywhere. I staggered backwards, touched the wall behind me with my back, and recoiled again. What I had sensed there were vines too. I had the feeling that there were more and more. They spread before my eyes and grew in all directions. But most of all, they grew towards the window and the door. Then the window was completely overgrown. What if the door was overgrown too? Was I then locked in here? Panic arose in me. With one leap, I was at the door, tore it open, and suddenly found myself in the middle of the tavern. Everything was quiet. No one was here. Only the fire flickered in the fireplace, but it was an ominous, greenish flicker. The lanterns, too, had all taken on that cold bluish hue. Suddenly I perceived movement behind the bar. At first I had difficulty recognizing the dark figure, but then I suddenly saw that it was Dragwa who was handling the barrels. Relieved, I walked up to him. I was about to speak to him, but he turned around. Startled, I backed away. I tripped over something, and by the time I had caught myself and looked back at the bar, Dragwa had disappeared. Instead, there was only a piece of paper. I mustered all my courage, went over and picked up the note. It said, "Activate the lemonade." Then, out of the corner of my eyes, I saw movement again. I wheeled around and saw the vines. They had spread throughout the room without my noticing, overgrown everything. Devious tables, chairs, and benches, and especially they were out to the windows and doors. Without thinking any further, I ran outside. But instead of going outside, I only came back into a new room, and it took me a moment to realize where I was. Then I remembered. Walter's dungeon. But Walter wasn't here. Instead, I was here. I tore at the bars like crazy, but they wouldn't open. Panic boiled up inside me and I screamed, "Help! Can't anyone hear me here? Let me out of here." Then I heard footsteps. The door at the top of the basement stairs opened, and then Margaret's voice was heard. "Walter? What is it? Go to sleep for heaven's sake. I'll bring you as many cocoa rolls as you want first thing in the morning. Please be quiet." "Margaret, please, it's me, let me out," I shouted in panic because I could already hear Margaret closing the door again. The door opened again, and someone slowly came down the steps. "Margaret, thank heaven, let me—" The rest of the words stuck in my throat. Again I staggered back and watched as this Margaret creature threw a note into my cell, turned without a word, and disappeared up the stairs. I felt dizzy. I lay down on the bed and closed my eyes for a moment. This had to be a dream. I began to pinch myself, to slap myself. There had to be some way I could wake myself up. But nothing helped. I continued to be stuck in Walter's cell, and it all felt so real. Not like it usually did when I dreamed, blurry and unclear. Only the sudden changes of locations were an indication that this might not be real. Suddenly I remembered the note and picked it up. "Rolls are not bread." When I looked up again, I was outside. It was still dark and all the lanterns were shimmering in that greenish light, but at least I was no longer locked in. Relieved, I sucked the cool, clear night air into my lungs and felt the panic in me subside. I was still worried, but I could now think much more clearly again. I sat down by the little stream as I had done before when I found Walter in his dungeon. I had been upset then too, but nothing compared to how I felt now. I let my gaze wander over the town. From up here there was a wonderful view over Angler's Rest, and except for the bluish light, everything seemed peaceful and the same as always. But when I glanced back at the bakery, I realized that nothing was the same. The entire bakery was overgrown with this blue-green stuff, and it seems as if the vines wanted to spread further across the landscape. One had already nearly reached my feet. I jumped up and ran blindly down the path, away from the bakery. I ran back toward the Kenny Kraken, but as I turned the corner by Sybil's house, I saw it. The tavern was also completely overgrown by now. Where was I supposed to go? My eyes fell on Sybil's house. Was that her? Was she responsible for all of this? No, Sybil's house was not an option. Looking down into the valley, I saw movement in Eric's yard. Was that Eric? It looked like it. Eric, I yelled, jumping up and down, gesticulating wildly. The figure looked up, and it was Eric. Not that horrible eyeless mask. No, it was really Eric's face, and he seemed to be beckoning me to come to him. I started to run. As I approached the house, I saw Eric disappear into it. Without thinking, I followed him, and suddenly found myself back in the Kenny Kraken. The walls and doors all looked normal again, no vines, nothing. Maybe if I just lay back in my bed and fell asleep, maybe then everything would be back to normal when I woke up in the morning. So I went to the door of my room, but there was no door. Nothing, just a wall, as if there had never been a door. I drove around. The other doors had also disappeared. I went back to the stairs, but there were no stairs. Instead, there was a cozy sitting area and bookshelves, as if they had always been there. What was happening here? Finally, my eyes fell on a frame on the wall with a note inside. In a portal, it's hotter than tomorrow. None of this made any sense. Again, I closed my eyes and was tempted to just let them closed. But a noise made me open them again. I was standing in a tiny room, and across from me was an unknown figure standing next to a bed. I couldn't believe it. It was a normal person. Where am I? Was the first thing I brought out, but the person just stared at me wordlessly. I looked around, and that's when I recognized it. The hermit's hut. Was that Ben? I quickly turned around again, because I was afraid that in the meantime everything behind me had changed again. But Ben was still standing where he had just been standing, staring at me. Are you Ben? I tried again. Again, just staring. What was wrong with him? I walked closer to him and noticed that somehow he wasn't real at all, more like a wooden puppet, and it wasn't staring at me at all, but at something behind me. I followed its gaze and again spotted a frame with a message. I walked over, took it out of the frame, and read, "Goats do charge backwards." These messages, was anyone trying to tell me something? But it was all incoherent babble. All of a sudden, I had the feeling that something had changed. I sensed something bad, so I turned around cautiously, very cautiously. As expected, the scene around me had changed again. I was standing in Hacknett's house, upstairs in his bedroom. On the lectern in front of the window was the book that Hacknett had shown me many weeks ago. At first, I didn't really pay attention to it, but then I saw it. It was moving, not the book itself, but the image on the open page. Cautiously, I approached the book and was fascinated. The scene showed a huge underground city. For the most part, it was overgrown by the blue-green vines, but one could still clearly see the mighty outlines that must have once shaped the image of the city. In its center rose a huge, altar-like structure, and on it stood a frame, as of a door or a portal. A sound behind me, all too familiar to me, made me start up. The monster. It was here. In slow motion, I crept backward to the ladder down. Margaret had said that if you didn't make any noise, it couldn't hear you, so I held my breath and slowly crawled down without even the slightest inkling of a sound. As soon as I was out of sight, I hurried down the remaining steps and outside. But outside, it hit me like a blow. Everything was overgrown. Hagnet's house, Eric's house, Sybil's home, even the bridge and the lighthouse of Angler's Rest were covered by the green-blue vines. And then I saw them everywhere. The creatures without eyes, the face constantly contorted into a scream, and the eerie pulsing in their open bellies. Where could I go now? Again I tried to get awake by pinching and hitting myself, but nothing helped. Was I trapped here? What if I never got out of here? What if I have to stay in this world forever? Completely consumed with panic, I ran. I had to get back to the mansion, had to see if it was still there. Without looking to the right and left, I ran through the nocturnal forest and arrived much faster than expected in front of the big house. I rushed up the stairs into my apartment, crawled up into the alcove between the ceiling and the roof, and hastily uncovered the chest. Hectically, I fumbled with the lock until I finally managed to open it. But what I found inside was not my book. I found just another note. This is all just a bad dream. This is not real. I just needed to wake up. But how? How? I had already tried everything possible. I'd had nightmares before. How had I woken up? And then it came back to me. I had always fallen into a bottomless void. I closed my eyes. Where could I find a bottomless void here? Desperately, I opened my eyes again, found myself just a few feet wide of a bottomless pit. Could it be that simple? Could I have just wished for something earlier and it would have appeared in front of me? Anyway, without thinking any further, I just jumped off the ledge and let myself fall. Usually, at this point in my dreams, I was completely panicked, but this time I felt just a deep relief spread through me. And then I hit the ground. From one moment to the next, everything hurt. I could not move. I no longer had control over any of my limbs. I could only feel them sticking out from me at the most impossible angles. And under my head, I felt a warm puddle forming. Out of focus, I could make out around me the outline of the mansion and a couple of figures.
Oh my God!
I don't know. I saw her come out of her apartment and get on the railing in front of Hoodie's door.
And then she just jumped.
Is that a suicide note in her hand?
It seems that way.
Let me see. It says this is the end.